Everybody knows one guy who thinks the refs are out to get his team, who hate his team, maybe even paid under the table to make bad calls against his team, and we just roll our eyes. But then there's that one game that makes us think maybe he's not so crazy.
Watson, touchdown!
Okay, so we know the non-call from the refs was a bad one, but what if the play call itself, given the situation, was more interesting? And what if we took a rewind to learn where Clemson got the idea for this call in the first place? All right, y'all, this is our second installment on the kind of the worst calls that we can think of that had actual postseason implications. And Clemson fans, Clemson, not Clemson, before y'all get at us in the comments, know that this is not a, hey, Clemson got away with one sort of situations. We're actually going to talk about how awesome this play call was for the Clemson offense and how bad, yes, it was that the refs missed the call, but there's a lot of interest around how we came about, how this play came about versus Alabama. And we want to dive a little deeper into this one play. And, real quick, Josh, 3 seconds on this. Was it or was it not a bad referee call that they didn't throw a flag on the pick?
It was a bad call. 100%.
Okay.
That's what it was.
Yes or no, real fast. Was it a genius call on Clemson's part to actually run the pick?
Oh, it was brilliant.
Yeah. And we talked about this in our how did Alabama lose so badly to Clemson this year in the national championship game? And we said it was because they got out-coached. And I think this is another example of where Clemson saw something on tape and they waited until they had the opportunity to exploit it. And not only that, but the situation was set up perfectly, given that if it gets flagged, they still kick a field goal, we go to overtime. If it doesn't get flagged, then they win the national championship. It's a win-win, Josh. But wait, we did say rewind in the little intro. We're going to rewind before we talk about this play. Let's take it back a little bit further and talk about two other pick plays, one of which didn't even involve Clemson, that may have given Dabo a little bit of insight on maybe to use this. We're not saying this is where they got it from, because these situations did not invent the pick play. We've seen it before, but it might have planted the seed in his head. So why don't you kick us off with, do you want to go Clemson Notre Dame or Notre Dame Florida State?
We'll start with Clemson Notre Dame, and we're going to talk about where Dabo got the idea for this. When he was in the game against Alabama, more than likely. We're going to get later into the situation with Alabama, what caused Clemson to run this particular play at that time, but this was not the first time that Clemson had ever seen the idea of a pick play. And they'd seen it before because Notre Dame had run it against them. Flashback to 2015. So this is the year prior to the Alabama-Clemson national championship pick play. At that time, number 6 Notre Dame, who was undefeated, 4-0, faced off against number 12 Clemson, who was 3-0. This was early in the season, and as part of Clemson's failed attempt to win a national title when they lost the first game against Alabama in a nail-biter. Notre Dame had driven the ball all the way down to the 2-yard line. It was first and goal, 11 seconds left in the game. Notre Dame was down 16-24. Notre Dame needed 8 points to tie the game with just 11 seconds. So they decided to take a shot for the end zone. And what did they do? They ran a pick play. Now, it's the same pick play, more or less, that Notre Dame would end up running against Alabama. And it worked for Notre Dame. They put the game to 24-22. And the only reason that Notre Dame didn't end up winning that game is that they failed on the 2-point conversion. So Clemson was able to win 24-22 as time expired. So this wasn't the first time Clemson had ever seen it. And if you wonder where they got it from Notre Dame, an opponent who ran it against them just a year prior, and another pivotal game also between undefeated teams. And that game obviously had playoff implications because Clemson is probably not in the position they were in at the end of the season if they fail to stop the 2-point conversion that resulted from the successful pick play.
So it's not exactly the same situation with Clemson and Notre Dame in that Notre Dame had to score a touchdown, so they didn't have the luxury of calling this pick play. And if it didn't, if it got flagged, still having an easy kick to push it to overtime. So it was a higher risk situation there, but almost kind of like a Hail Mary there. Let's talk about Notre Dame, Florida State, which is kind of even more interesting because it actually was flagged, and set that one up, and then maybe we can flow through all the way back to Alabama.
All right, let's rewind to the first time Notre Dame ran this in recent memory. So 2014, Florida State, number 2, Notre Dame, number 5, both undefeated, again playing early in the year. Notre Dame is trailing in this game 27-31. There's less than 30 seconds on the clock. It's 4th and goal from the 2-yard line. Notre Dame has to score to win this game, and they have to score a touchdown, unlike Clemson in a few years. Notre Dame calls a play that they thought would give them the best shots to win, and that was a pick play thrown to the outside of the field. Now, in this particular instance, that pick play got called, and it got called because the 2 receivers, they had a 3-wide set on that side of the field, were really obvious in how heavily they blocked. So even though Notre Dame scored on that play, it ends up coming back. They end up having to face a 4th and 18 with very little time left. Of course, they fail to convert 4th and goal from the 18, and the game ends. But what I think is notable here is, one, we see what happens when you don't convert, that obviously you end up with a first, whatever in goal situation, but now 17, 18 yards out, which is extremely difficult from that part of the field to convert and to actually be able to score a touchdown. 2, this game had direct playoff implications itself. Now, we talked about bad calls that affected things. This was a good call. It clearly should have been called a pick play, but this had actually, arguably had about as much implication as the Alabama-Clemson play did. Again, that Alabama-Clemson play wasn't the be-all, end-all. We'll talk about that in a second. But if Notre Dame actually scores, if that play isn't flagged on the field, Florida State probably does not make the 2014 playoff, which means Baylor or TCU would have gotten in at the end. So that play actually had massive implications. And I'm sure there's a lot of Baylor and TCU fans out there that think their teams would have had a very good shot in 2014 of winning the title. Well, we'll never know, but that play actually may have defined it. So that play, again, the next year even, 2015 Notre Dame Clemson, that play obviously had massive implications because Clemson ends up playing in the national title. Notre Dame had 3 losses in the season, but they only had 2 in the regular season. If they had beaten Clemson, there's a good shot that Notre Dame would have been in the playoffs. So all 3 of these plays in progression, Florida State versus Notre Dame trying it again against Clemson, and then Clemson against Alabama, all had a direct impact on who either won the championship or who played for the championship in 3 consecutive years of college football.
And it's interesting, obviously, because you show the significance of these 3 plays. And again, we're not saying that nobody had ever heard of a pick play at the goal line before we saw it. One of the things that is crazy about the pick is it's been used more and more in the last few years because it's kind of like there was a window of time where the 3 yards beyond the line of scrimmage on an RPO wasn't getting called heavily and people were exploiting it. I think people are exploiting the pick play a good bit as kind of a function of their offense. I feel like Missouri did that a few years ago pretty heavily. And now we kind of get into this Alabama-Clemson setup where, they needed 3 points to push the thing to overtime. And Alabama fans, before you get mad that we're praising Dabo for making this call on the goal line, I'm pretty sure you remember an Iron Bowl that you guys wouldn't have had and a national championship in 2009 that you wouldn't have had if it wasn't for a pretty massive pick play that freed Julio Jones in the middle of the field on that game-winning drive. So y'all don't get too mad at us for heaping some praise on Clemson here. But to me, it's kind of like the reverse of the pass interference thing. So there's such a limited penalty when you're close to the goal line for pass interference that on the last play of the game, I'm doing a lot of pass interference because what do you get? If you get caught, it's replay the play half the distance to the goal, which in a red zone situation or a goal line situation with limited time, is not that big of you're not giving up much. It's the opposite of the Notre Dame one that led them to 4th and 18 instead of 4th and 3. This is the same thing in reverse. If Dabo knows that first of all, he knows what the Alabama defense is going to do. He knew how they were going to line up. He knew where their vulnerabilities were going to be. They ran a pretty, it was a pretty obvious pick play to me. But he's playing a game within a game to know that, okay, if we get a flag here, no big deal. We go to overtime. Worst case scenario. He rolls the dice because he also knows that late in the game, refs are probably going to have their flags in their pockets for the most part on that sort of stage. I don't think I would have caught a pick there, even though it was pretty obvious. He rolls the dice, and why not? I mean, you're the underdog coming in. It's a huge opportunity, and the only gamble here, I would say, is if he doesn't catch the ball, or if it takes a little bit longer, if it takes another second or two longer to run the play, then you may not have time to kick a field goal. But that's pretty minimal in my opinion. I think it was a good call. It was a bad no call. But given the situation, would you do the same thing?
I would. And again, let's step back and consider these two other plays that we flagged, right? What did they have in common? They both got completed. And the first play, Notre Dame against Florida State in 2014, they did get flagged for it, and they were blatantly obvious about it. Again, you can say the Clemson Alabama one's obvious, but you go back and watch the Florida State Notre Dame one, it's a lot worse. Hands outside, blocking, just square drive blocking the guy, two guys, and actually two receivers doing it. Really obvious flag. But he did catch the ball. They completed the pass. It's just a matter of the fact that they got flagged for it. Now, in Notre Dame's case, in that game, it's 4th and goal from the 2, time's running out. They had to get a touchdown on that play. So they called something that they knew was risky, but it was also their best shot to actually get the ball in the end zone, which they'd failed to done for 3 straight plays in a game that's pretty highly contested. Again, Notre Dame Clemson the next year, it's 11 seconds to go in the game. You're down 8. Again, you got to score a touchdown, and you got 2 plays to do it. You're willing to risk the penalty. And that time they did a much better job of knowing how to run the pick so they wouldn't be called. And that's what Clemson learned from. One, they learned how to run the pick without being called. And they learned that from the Clemson Notre Dame game from the year prior, and how Notre Dame had learned themselves from their game against Florida State. And 2, Clemson knew if they were penalized, they were still going to be able to kick a field goal to tie the game. So they were in a situation where they needed to score, and they had to score immediately. They didn't have much time. And they were in a situation where they could afford to be backed up and kick a field goal to send the go to overtime, which is sort of the default a lot of people would have taken anyway. So it's doubly safe. You've called a play that gives you the best odds to actually score, and the worst result is you back up and you have to kick the field goal from about this, maybe the 16, 17 yard line, which is still a 26, 27 yard field goal, still quite doable. I guess maybe a 30-yard field goal when you do the drop back. But it's a pretty makeable field goal, right? Actually, I would say a very makeable field goal. And that's worst case if you don't get the 2-point pick play being successful. And you're assuming, right, that if you just decided to go straight for the field goal, even from the 2, that doesn't get blocked, which is half your problem from that distance. So it all sort of comes together. Clemson knew the situation they were in. They knew they could afford the penalty. They knew the touchdown wins the game outright. And they said, we're going to take the small risk that this ends the game now, and the small risk that we're going to have a missed field goal if there's a penalty. And for the much greater, let's say, 60, 70% chance that this doesn't get called based off their experience from Clemson Notre Dame and how it looked, and go, okay, well, if this works, then we've got a 65% chance to win the game. If it doesn't work, then we kick the field goal, and probably, given the fact that Alabama was gassed in that game, they were unable to really score, especially in the red zone with Jalen Hurts. They had a very good shot of winning in overtime. Alabama at that point would have been playing over 100 plays of defense. So they knew they probably had, let's say, a 3 out of 4 shot of winning in overtime, and let's say they have an 80% chance of having the field goal, well, probably more than that, like a 90% chance. At that point, by running the pick play, you get a 65% chance of winning there, and then if it doesn't work, you probably have, for the remaining 35%, maybe an 80% chance of that scenario also playing out in your favor. So you put yourself in a position where you're like 90, 95% likely to win the game. It completely made sense from Clemson's perspective. You can talk about cheating and how unfair it is that you should never call a play that's illegal, and nobody's ever going to admit that. But there's nothing wrong with calling a play that you think gives you your best shot. And the only illegal plays in college football are the plays that get flagged on the field at the end of the day. And again, they had this play run against them. Notre Dame scored on that play, and that went by. It's just that this play was front and center, end of the year, year-defining play. But let's not forget that there were two other plays in the past 2 years that had almost as much impact. They happened during the season with different results. And then we forget about the history that led to that Clemson-Notre Dame play, or the Clemson-Alabama play, I should say, and how all this stuff tied together to give Clemson their national title in 2016.
Yeah, I don't think I never thought for a minute about like any ethical or moral concerns about calling a play that is technically illegal because, look, I mean, kind of like, and I hate when people say this, but there's holding on every play or whatever. The pick play, and this is another reason why I think it didn't get called in the end zone. It wasn't a function of Clemson's offense at large. Like, there are offenses that cannot function unless they can push the boundary on the 3 yards beyond the line of scrimmage. There's teams that offenses can't function if they can't hold like crazy. There's a number. There's a chart that was out there that actually a Michigan site put out that showed how much of an outlier Alabama was in terms of teams against them never having holding called against them. And people use that. You could see it. They use it as a function of their offense. Clemson didn't do that in this game. They didn't do that in any game. They used it. And that's why it's more coaching to me, because it's situational. And he only saw that it would work because of what he saw on tape and prepared for. So I think that is totally a game within a game. And look, if it's quote unquote illegal and it gets flagged, then he's penalized for it within the rules. So I'm calling genius call, terrible no call on the ref's part, terrible no call, genius call because of the situation, because it takes into consideration every possible scenario that you just outlined. I love it. Absolutely love it. And given the opportunity, I would do the same thing 10 out of 10 if I was smart enough to figure it out. Any other thoughts on this call in particular, either from the ref side or from the play call itself?
I think two things I'll end with here. One, you can't underestimate the impact that the injury to Eddie Jackson had in that game. Eddie Jackson's injury forced Minkah Fitzpatrick into safety, and that forced Tony Brown down in a corner that played the slot. I think if you have Minkah Fitzpatrick, who would have been the guy defending the receiver in that play, I'm not sure it works, and I'm not sure it happens. And there's absolutely zero doubt that Clemson was fully aware that Tony Brown was going to be the guy covering the receiver, Hunter Renfrow, and not Minkah Fitzpatrick. So I know the end of that year we talked about before the NFL draft that you can go back and find our video. We said Eddie Jackson was the sleeper of that class. It was ridiculous that he was drafted where he was. Didn't matter. They had a broken leg. We both thought he was the best safety to come out in a couple years. We're on tape saying that, so I feel comfortable repeating it. I don't think we were wrong. That had a tremendous impact in that game. The second thing I will say is, given the situation, the reason why this is where it's at on my list is I'm not sure the play really mattered. Because if they did get the flag, I think they do kick the field goal. And Alabama, again, the next snap was going to be the 100th snap they played on defense. They were gassed. And that was one of the best defenses we've seen in the past 20 years of college football. Arguably, Alabama's 2011 defense was very good. I think the 2016 unit, especially when healthy, was even better. But they were just worn out in that game. I don't think Alabama could have won in overtime. Alabama fans, feel free to fight me on that. But that's the only reason why this play is where it is to me, because as much as it ended the game with a success, it's important to remember a failure on this play and a correct call doesn't end the game right then and there. You probably end up with the same result.
Yeah, unlike the previous, and this is a series we're doing. This is only the second one we've done, number 4. Number 5 was Oklahoma, Oregon, and it was egregious. Like it was an egregious give the game to the other team sort of thing. Yes, Oklahoma still gave up a touchdown after the onside kick, but that was blatant, obvious, and the game is over right there if the penalty's called correctly. I do think it's also interesting to point out Eddie Jackson, because this series has been kind of noted by what players in the secondary were healthy and what weren't, because I don't think if Clemson doesn't have a key injury in 2015 in their secondary, I don't think OJ Howard's running free in the third quarter, fourth quarter, maybe all four quarters in that game for Alabama to win it. So that's an interesting point as well. Thanks y'all for hanging out with us on another one of these. Please remember to subscribe. We're doing other stuff besides game previews and reviews. And we're trying to get some of this kind of in the off season, but we're ramping up into our season coverage. So we're going to sprinkle these throughout. We had another one that I just referenced that nobody has watched, apparently. Oklahoma and Oregon. That was one of the worst calls we've ever seen in our life, and it had postseason implications. So we'll have that one as an end card and linked in the description if you want to check it out. Clemson fans, we're happy to give you some love on this one. I know y'all get at us sometimes, but we nothing but praise on this call. It was a great one. Thanks for watching. Thanks y'all so much. Have a great week, and God bless.